How's it going, American history students? This is Mr. Bell coming back at you with another video lesson. Today we're going to be covering American History 1, Unit 3, Section 3, so 3.3, which talks about several treaties, but the main topic of this section is going to be the War of 1812, which is the second war between America and England. So, the French Revolution was raging through Europe, and you had two members of Washington's cabinet, Alexander Hamilton, the first Secretary of the Treasury, who was partial to the British, and his political rival Jefferson, who was Secretary of State, who was partial to France. Of course, Jefferson had a home in France. That's where he had the Treaty of Paris negotiated. And each of these men was lobbying George Washington, the first president, to intervene on behalf of the others. Biggest ally. So with Jefferson that being France and with Hamilton that being England. Instead, Washington defaults to his position of the three no's, one of which is no foreign alliances, the others are no sectionalism, no political parties, and since he doesn't believe in foreign alliances, he sticks to his guns and he says we're going to issue a proclamation of neutrality. We don't get involved in the French Revolution. Pinckney's Treaty. An easy way to remember this for a quiz or test, it sounds kind of crazy, but I think it helps students, is Pinckney-Sippy. Pinckney's Treaty gives us the Mississippi River, and we're getting this from Spain, also the port of New Orleans. So not what will become the entire state, but control of a port that the French had controlled. Now, we're paying a lot of money during these treaties, but what we're going to get on the back end will make it well worth it. Jay's Treaty. So there were a ton of redcoats left over post-Revolutionary War after the occupation, especially in and around Boston. We want to get those troops out of the United States, get them off of American soil back to England, since this is no longer the British colonies, it's the United States of America. And we signed Jay's Treaty, which evacuates those British forts, makes the British return home, and kind of clears out the redcoats for the first time since England colonized America. The easy way to remember this is Jay's Treaty. Jay says British go away, referring to the British troops. Louisiana Purchase. Thomas Jefferson. He struggles with the decision whether or not to buy Louisiana from France. Again, Jefferson's close to France. He's very good friends with their leader at the time, Napoleon Bonaparte, and they control all this territory in what will be the United States, of course. The Louisiana Territory. Don't confuse this with the state of Louisiana. The state of Louisiana is very small. The purchase that you're going to see, this Louisiana Territory, is gigantic. It's a third of America. Now, Jefferson struggles with this, though. It's a fair price. It's $15 million, which is a ton of money, but the resources will outweigh the cost up front, and just the development of this land will also be a lot of money, but that's not the issue. Jefferson is a Democratic Republican, meaning he's an anti-federalist, so he's a strict interpreter of the Constitution. And nowhere in the Constitution does it say that a president has right to buy foreign land from a foreign leader. He goes against his beliefs as a strict interpreter. He buys Louisiana from Napoleon for $15 million. He sends Lewis, Clark, who are essentially map makers, along with the Shoeshine Indian girl, Sacagawea, to explore this undiscovered territory and to map it out so that it can be settled as we begin westward expansion. Adams-Onis Treaty gives us Florida. An easy way I tell students to remember this is Adams on his way to Florida. Again, these are kind of not the most eloquent tricks maybe, but they work on quizzes or tests, and we sign this with Spain. Hamilton and Burr. So there's three things that lead to the death of the Federalist Party. The first we covered in 3.1, which was the election of 1800. That was Jefferson defeating John Adams, becoming the first Democratic Republican president. The next one is the death of Alexander Hamilton at the hands of Aaron Burr in a duel. And once they lose their leader, the Federalist Party begins to deteriorate. There's a lot that goes into this duel that I'm not going to get into for the purposes of a video lesson. I highly recommend watching Hamilton on Disney Plus if you have time, and at least watching the Hamilton-Burr duel section. So, we have a conflict known as Tecumseh's War. The easiest comparisons to stuff we've studied so far are Pontiac's Rebellion and, of course, King Philip's War. So this is a war between the United States and the Indian Confederacy. Tecumseh is a Shawnee Indian leader. Now, William Henry Harrison becomes famous in the Battle of Tippecanoe, in which he fights Tecumseh, and this battle kind of gets spilled over into the War of 1812. So while the War of 1812 is mainly a war between England and America, it's also the United States resolving some of their outstanding Indian conflicts, one of which is with the newly formed Indian Confederacy, in which all these tribes have coming together hasn't worked, so they kind of begin to branch off into their own little independent confederacies and try to fight back that way. And this ends with the Shawnee Indian Tecumseh getting killed at the Battle of Thames in 1813, and this led to the end of the American Indian Confederacy. So, after this loss, natives in the region were forced to sell land and move west, and this is going to set the stage down the line for Andrew Jackson's Indian removal, and we're going to cover that toward the end of Unit 4. William Henry Harrison becomes famous for killing Tecumseh at the Battle of Thames. It looks like Thames, but it's pronounced Thames. And he is going to use this to kind of catapult his political career. That's what you see. It worked for George Washington. So a lot of aspiring presidents kind of try to model themselves after that. Establish himself in the military, in particular in a big war, get name ID, and then they're able to run for the presidency. William Henry Harrison does this, but after catching pneumonia, his inauguration only serves for 1 month. The XYZ Affair. So what you're going to see now as we try to become an established country is other world powers start to test our Navy and see, okay, are we where we need to be on that front? With the XYZ Affair, you have blatant disrespect from the French. We had been asked to pay these tributes or tolls, and James Madison, who's the president at the time, gets very, very upset and offended by it, and he says, we're not going to pay these tolls anymore. He said, I'd rather pay $1 million for defense and not a penny for tribute. In other words, I'd rather pay millions fighting a war than pay these needless tolls. So, before conflict, though, with the XYZ Affair breaks out, we try to resolve this in a peaceful way, and we send a delegation to France to negotiate with their leadership, and they are greeted after a long journey there by 3 random men. One says I'm X, the other says I'm Y, the other says I'm Z. Go back and tell your president, President Madison, I believe it was James Monroe he had sent, who was the Secretary of State at the time, who will go on to become the 5th president. Go back and tell your president, Mr. Madison, that we're not going to, that you're going to continue to pay these tributes. Madison becomes furious. This leads to an undeclared quasi-war, naval war between France and America, where no real winner is declared. The only way they start respecting our Navy is we continue to build it up. Another way Madison does this is he defeats the Barbary pirates, and that's a big proving ground for our Navy. Thomas Jefferson's a widely successful president, but his failure with the Embargo Act of 1807 toward the end of his presidency is what a lot of people remember, and it's unfortunate to be judged on your worst mistake. So a lot of his detractors will point to this as him maybe potentially being a failed president. So England wanted their colonies back. They didn't respect America as an independent nation, which is going to lead to us fighting a second war. And the goal for England going into the War of 1812 is, let's see if we can get them at sea. Okay? It was not a naval conflict, really, the Revolutionary War. So if we can draw them into a naval conflict, that's where we crush them. That's where we have the advantage. And one of the ways they do this is through impressments. Impressments are the kidnapping of sailors, of American sailors, via the British Royal Navy, and they are given one of two options: either swear their allegiance to the king, denounce America, or they could die. So you had a lot of people who chose to swear their allegiance to the king rather than die, and they were beginning to take over the lesser parts of our Navy. And it wasn't just naval ships, they were attacking cargo ships. So Jefferson says, I know how to stop impressments. We will just not ship goods overseas. And he does this. He said everything could be American made. Well, we're getting even more globalized back then. So what you have is goods sit in warehouses because we're not able to ship them out because we're not shipping anywhere overseas, and it kills the economy toward the end of his presidency. Of course, the War of 1812 kind of rejuvenates manufacturing and brings us out of that. This is a cartoon that represents the Embargo Act. You have the turtle, oh grab me, which is embargo spelled backwards. He is snipping the butt here of the Federalist who's trying to ship his stuff overseas. You have the Democratic Republican Jefferson sicking the Embargo Act on him. So if you see that cartoon on a test, you'll know what it is. And of course, the reason you had the Federalists trying to ship their stuff overseas is because this did hurt the Northeast more, who relied on more manufacturing, which was a Federalist hotbed. It didn't hurt the South as much, which was Democratic Republican territory, which was more rural and relied on agriculture. War hawks are people who would rather fight it out than talk it out. Famous war hawks are Jefferson and Madison. They push us toward a second war with England. This is called the War of 1812. I'm going to come back to this one. So, some defining moments of the War of 1812. The White House is attacked. It is burned to the ground. Slave Paul Jennings saves the original Washington portrait. That's why it's ripped on the bottom. And it won't be rebuilt until James Monroe's inauguration in 1817. Fort McHenry is attacked, some major fort in Baltimore. You have the right outside of Baltimore. You have the Battle of Baltimore. This is where Francis Scott Key will write the Star-Spangled Banner in relation to this battle. The Treaty of Ghent ends this war. The easy way to remember this is the Treaty of Ghent. The War of 1812 went away as far as a test or quiz. But I do want to go back here to the Battle of New Orleans. Now, this is the most important battle of this war, even though it doesn't have any impact on the war, and here's why. The Battle of New Orleans technically takes place after the Treaty of Ghent was signed, but message hasn't gotten to New Orleans in time for them not to fight this battle. Andrew Jackson's vastly outnumbered. He leads the American forces in a big victory against the British that he had no business winning. Jackson becomes famous for this battle. People start to learn about this story of him coming from nothing to being this powerful military leader. And we're off to the races with Andrew Jackson's political career. And he will be one of the most influential presidents of the 1800s, especially the early 1800s. And he does some good things, but a lot of bad things too. So this war is probably most infamous for making Andrew Jackson's political aspirations that much more attainable. Some effects of the War of 1812. The Federalist Party dissolves because post-War of 1812, an event called the Hartford Convention, the New England states try to secede from the United States and make New England a separate country. The vote fails. When that fails, especially following the death of Hamilton, then the Federalist Party dissolves. You enter a period called the Era of Good Feelings, in which under Monroe's presidency you only have one political party, is the Democratic Republicans. One political party, rather. It's increased nationalism, increased manufacturing. After the War of 1812, we defeated England twice. We're established. Things are feeling good in the United States. So that's going to do it for our coverage of these treaties in the War of 1812 and Unit 3. Please email any questions regarding this, our earlier Unit 3 stuff from 3.1 and 3.2, or any American History 1 materials to bsbell@clevelandcountyschools.org. Thank you. Have a great day.